This morning I'm talking with Stephanie Lau, a training associate here at VCU's RRTC, and who provides support and employment assistance for adults with autism in our research project. So Stephanie, tell me what you're doing here.
I'm currently a training associate at VCU Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. I have been working for the last 3 years as an employment specialist, which means that I was going out into the community to help individuals with disabilities find and maintain employment.
And during the course of this this work, what kinds of supports do you typically provide? Say someone who has autism who's trying to find work.
With autism, it's really interesting because a lot of times there's unique specialized skills, but they might not be able to fulfill all the job requirements of a full job description. So a large part of my job is going out and networking with businesses and carving out a position that is unique and suits the business needs, but also suits the skills and abilities of the individual that we're working with. So a big piece is to carve that job and customize and create a new position. Once we have that position secured, we still have to sometimes teach the task. So it could be helping them identify what the checklists are, exactly what they have to do, the production standard, how fast they have to do their work. And for autism, another huge thing is just teaching them how to interact socially in the workplace.
And before we began working together on the iPod Touch study, had you been using anything that you would call assistive technology in your work?
Occasionally I might have an individual that I was working with who's using a Dynavox, but that was usually a piece of equipment that the individual already had access to. As far as assistive technology, typically on the job site, not really. They were usually compensatory strategies that we created here in the office that might be laminated papers, checklists, kind of pictures on a sheet of paper, things like that.
The more low-tech use
Exactly.
of some kind of strategy. How many people have you worked with in the study so far?
So in the study, I've worked with 5 different individuals using iPods as assistive technology, but what's been great is that I can take all the lessons we've learned and extrapolate it to my other clients. So since working on the iPod project, I would say I've worked with at least 2 other individuals that happen to have an iPhone or an iPod, and we just brought it into the workplace and utilized the same information to help them.
What kinds of strategies are you using with the iPod?
Really, what I've noticed that is probably the best thing about the iPod is that the applications that I use the most are native to the iPod. So we don't have to always download fancy applications. Timers, alarms, notes to use task analysis or checklists, those usually suffice, and that's usually where I start. The apps I do download that have been very useful might be StoryKit, so that we can create an interactive checklist, especially for an individual that would otherwise look at a checklist and maybe read the whole thing but not comprehend each individual step or want to go step by step. And StoryKit can allow you to go step by step. It also has a verbal as well as a visual and a written component. So if this is an individual that would respond better to verbal prompts, you can record the steps as opposed to relying on them having to read the steps.
StoryKit allows you to have pictures and audio prompts like you're describing. Does it seem helpful to you that they sort of swipe to the next slide? Or is that better than having just a whole list in front of you on the screen?
I think so, because it makes them focus on just that one step. Because sometimes we are working with individuals that just are looking at, I want to be done. I want to be done, and they don't necessarily want to take all the steps towards completing the task correctly. And so if they're forced to really just look at one step at a time and make sure that they are doing one step at a time and they're not skipping ahead.
Is there any app, native or otherwise, that you've used with every one of your clients?
Alarms. Just the alarms, and what I love about it is that you can set them to be repeating alarms. So I've worked with some individuals who honestly just don't have the technological background or the literacy to really set up their own iPod. So I can set up the alarms on a repeating basis for every day that they work, And I know that this allows me to no longer be in the workplace to provide that verbal prompt of, okay, now you need to go to the next task. Instead, there's going to be an alarm that they can respond to.
And so their job is to hear the alarm or respond to whatever the alarm looks like, and do what it says and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, so that does require training, to say, here, these alarms are going to go off at this time, read what it says, go and complete the task, don't just simply turn it off. So you do have to train an individual to make sure that they respond appropriately to the alarms, but once that is done, really, you're no longer required to be in the workplace to supply that verbal prompt.
So it's helping people move from one task to another, and so it's really a transitional prompt that you would otherwise have to do personally.
In a lot of cases, I know there's one individual that we've worked with, the Virginia Employment Commission, and that was exactly the situation for her, is that she liked to complete a task. And her particular problem was that if she had a task in front of her, she would do it to completion, regardless of whether or not there was other work that she also had to get done in the day. So by scheduling times in her day to switch to another task, we were able to make sure that she completed all the necessary steps in one day.
Are there other apps that you use more than others?
Calendar has also been great, and again, it just depends on the individual. Some people, we just use the native calendar. Some individuals, we've actually synced it to their Google Calendar or to a calendar on their laptop or computer, so that it can be a little bit more utilitarian. But it's just been a great way to remind them, when do you work, especially if they have a flexible schedule, or if there's a day that they are required to work that's out of the ordinary, to put it into the calendar and teach them to look at their calendar means that they're not missing appointments, that they're getting to work on time. You can also set up alarms in the calendar so that they are responding to, oh, I have an alarm, or I have a meeting coming up in half an hour, I need to get ready for it. And that's been really great for a lot of the individuals that we work with autism, just because if it's not regular and routine, they don't think about it as something that they have to do. So teaching them to use the calendar has been a great way to keep them kind of prioritizing their time, and also not scheduling conflicts. And actually the two in tandem, the alarms and the calendar, have been really great, because I have one individual that he has an alarm that goes off every morning that tells him to check his calendar, so that he can then look at his calendar and say, okay, these are the things I need to do today.
If you were just trying to average out, how many apps does a typical client of yours use on the job?
Really not necessarily that many. It just depends exactly on how complex their job is, but I would say on average 2 to 3 apps are really all we need to get them through what they need to do in a day.
And going back to the reminders, most of us use reminders from time to time on our phones.
Oh yes.
For those really important things that we don't want to forget.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that in many cases the clients I work with use many more reminders than we typically would.
Yeah.
Has that been your experience as well?
Definitely. I have one individual that just, I think he needs to kind of mentally prepare for certain things. So if he has an appointment at noon, he actually has multiple calendars set up so that he can give himself a reminder when he wakes up that morning, so he knows, okay, if I'm going to a meeting, I have to dress appropriately for the meeting. But then he will have another reminder maybe an hour before, so that he doesn't forget, and then another reminder 30 minutes before you need to start traveling to go to that meeting. Because otherwise it is possible for him just to get very involved in the work that he's doing and to completely forget about an appointment that he has.
This takes me to a question about who's in charge of setting these reminders.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, I imagine you're setting everything up for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been anyone that you've worked with who's been able to move on to setting their own prompts?
Yes. Can I say names?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Bill Lamont has really learned how to use his iPod independently. Sometimes he might need a few reminders, as far as, he'll want me to remind him of something. I have to say, oh, Bill, what can you do? And he'll be like, oh yeah, and he'll pull out his iPod and he'll put down the reminder, put it in his calendar. And and then put reminders for himself to look at his calendar. He's a great example of someone that if it's not a routine thing that he does every single day, he doesn't think about it.
I think that leads us to the question, for people who are being asked to respond to reminder alarms but not setting them themselves, how much support over time are you needing to give them? Because I imagine you'd have to change the reminders from time to time as their job tasks change or as their situation changes.
Definitely. And I think that kind of actually brings up an excellent point, that the iPod is not a panacea. You can't just simply give it to an individual and it's going to solve all the problems in the workplace. You still have to identify exactly what are the tasks and how you can solve whatever issue it is that an individual is having when it comes to completing the task correctly. And you have to put a lot of initial time into setting up the iPod, teaching someone how to use it, teaching them to respond to it. But the payoff at the end is huge because there is a lot of time initially, but over time, I feel like I can wean myself out of the job site much faster than I could if I didn't have an iPod or another piece of technology for them to use instead of relying so much on me. Because that's one danger of being a job coach, is that the individual can start to rely on you for all the prompts, all the transitions. Am I doing it correctly? Am I not doing it correctly? And so having them learn to focus on the iPod means that you can remove yourself much faster, because they're learning from the beginning to use the iPod as opposed to the person. And then that just goes with supported employment. Yes, things do change. You do have to go in and change things on the iPod. And what's great about supported employment is because of follow along, once they're stable, we're still checking in on them to make sure that the job tasks haven't changed too drastically and they don't know how to perform the new task, or that the iPod no longer matches the work that they're doing, so we can go in and kind of adjust these things if necessary. And for some individuals we do, because they don't have the technology like literacy to do it themselves. But for other individuals, like I mentioned Bill Lamond, he would be able to adjust it himself.
When, of the people that you've used these devices with, have you had situations where the devices were lost or broken?
Yeah. We've had a few situations where I think on 2 occasions, one individual lost his, another one the screen actually stopped working. For the individual that the screen stopped working, we were able to get another one because he was still using it in the workplace. For another individual, he had actually phased off of really requiring the iPod on his workplace. So it's just like any other compensatory strategy, that they might need the checklist a lot when they first start, but it gets to the point where they don't really need the checklist anymore.
So tell me about that. Have there been, there's at least one person you mentioned, have there been other people who've faded their need for the AT?
Actually, Beth Palmer at the VEC would be a great example, who's faded her AT, where I used to have to prompt her to transition from one task to the other, and then we started teaching her to rely on the iPod alarms and timers to transition to one task. Now it's internalized. I've actually gone there and she's sitting and she's doing her work and she looks at her iPod and she says, "In 1 minute, I'm going to go get the meal." And then she waits for the alarm to go off and then she clicks it and then she goes. So she still responds to it, but she obviously doesn't need to anymore because she's internalized these patterns in her day.
Right. Do you think if she didn't have the iPod, she would make those transitions?
I think that for her, because she does, anxiety is an issue for Beth, I think that having the iPod is still kind of a comforting crutch for her, but I don't think it would be necessary that it was there for her to do what she has to do, but I think that she likes the comfort of following the schedule and having the routine. So it's not necessary, but she still uses it for security.
We've talked about using iPods as reminders and as task sequencing prompters. You just mentioned one person you've worked with who has anxiety issues, and I know most of us starting a new job are anxious and somewhat confused.
Yeah.
Are there apps or strategies you're using on the devices specifically aimed at helping people be more relaxed on the job?
Definitely, and this is where I think you just have to be creative and get to know the individual and find what is a good fit and what's a good fit for the job environment as well. I think anyone who has a smartphone or an iPod uses it for recreational purposes. And so there's nothing wrong with really allowing the client to use it for recreational purposes on the job site, as long as it's scheduled and it makes sense that they're doing it. So if you have a situation where someone has a break or downtime, that's often when a lot of our clients get into trouble, when they do something that they're not supposed to do, or that they don't know how to handle that downtime, and that alone can create some anxiety. So if we give them something structured, like, you have this 15-minute break, you can play Angry Birds while you have this 15-minute break. That's fine. That's structuring their downtime. Bill Lamond, when he gets anxious, likes to look at the Hubble satellite app that he's downloaded, and he just likes looking at the pictures. Beth, she would become very anxious waiting for Caravan, just because of the waiting for it, not knowing exactly when it was going to arrive. She's very punctual. She likes to know exactly when things are going to happen. And we were able to figure out that listening to music was a great way for her to relax and reduce that anxiety. And actually, I have another individual who wasn't part of the study, but we've also learned from him that when he gets very anxious, music helps calm him down. He, in fact, actually has an anxiety tied to weather. So if the weather is really bad, it's hard for him to do any work because it's hard for him to focus. So we worked it out with the employer that he can clock out, he can go somewhere and sit down and listen to his music until his panic subsides, and then he can go right back to work. So it's just figuring out what works for an individual, and again, just making sure that in the workplace it's an okay strategy for them to use.
When clients work in a Wi-Fi enabled workplace, they can use an iPod Touch as a communication device in the same way that you might use a cell phone. Have you done that with any of your clients?
I have. One individual, we downloaded Google Chat so that individual could use Google Chat to contact me. On my phone, I downloaded Google Chat as well. And so it's just basically kind of like an IM, but that way, she didn't have to use her minutes on her phone. It was discreet if it was kind of a panic issue or question, and she didn't really want her employer to know that she was contacting me, because in this particular case she didn't want to disclose, that it was a discreet way for her to contact me and communicate with me. So.
Have you run into situations where your clients have been distracted by the device in a way so that it impacted their work?
Yes.
And what did you do about that?
So there's a couple of things you can do. If it's the camera, you can turn off the camera. If it's Wi-Fi and actually they're going on to the internet to check the weather, or they're going onto the internet to just watch YouTube videos, you can turn off the Wi-Fi signal. So there's ways to disable some of the apps. And some of the situations outside of the study where we've used individuals' personal iPhones, we've had to discuss, like, yes, you are using your phone, but that doesn't mean that you can answer a phone call when your friend calls you. So we've talked about, we schedule into their day that one of the first things they do is they turn the phone onto airplane mode so that they can still use the functions of the phone, but not actually receive any cellular signal or phone calls. So you have to figure out, what are some of the issues that this particular individual might have on the job site, and how can you handle them? And sometimes we end up going back to a low-tech, situation, just because for some individuals, the technology is just too much fun, and it becomes something that they do instead of work. And for those individuals, you go back to the compensatory strategies. But I would say that for most individuals, you can kind of deactivate whatever it is that's causing a distraction.
How did you learn to do this?
I have an iPhone. So I spent a lot of time just playing with different apps. I mean, it was useful that I had an iPhone prior to the study, so I was familiar with the basic technology, and I knew what I utilized it for myself. I mean, my iPhone is my AT. It has my emails, it has my calendar, it has my contact information. So I knew how universal and how utilitarian it could be. So I was really excited about the project. So it helped that I already came in with an idea of how to use the technology. and then it was great that because I had the technology, when I'm on the job site and I'm observing what the particular problem is, I could go back to the office, go home, and just search different apps, download them onto my phone, play with them, and see, okay, would this be the solution for the problem that we're having? So I think I had done that before, where one individual wasn't keeping up with the production standard that he needed to. So after talking to his employer, she had mentioned to me that one of the things that she does is she just keeps a song in her head and she just goes to that tune in order to maintain that level of production. And he's not allowed to listen to music on the floor for his particular job, but we were able to download a metronome app, so we could set how fast did the metronome go, and this is the pace that you need to keep in order to do your work at the necessary speed. So
and he used earbuds, and that's how
he wasn't allowed to have the earbuds in for just safety concerns, but he had an armband, so it was close enough that he could just hear the tick tock, tick tock. Yeah.
One strategy that we haven't talked about, but that I think is very popular, at least in school settings, is using video modeling for different things, task sequencing, wayfinding, those kinds of things, behavioral cueing. Have you used video modeling, and have you found it useful?
I have with Beth, just because I think that she could sometimes become desensitized to me telling her all the time, you know, when you're waiting for a caravan, you need to wait on the sidewalk. We did a video modeling of her telling herself what she needed to do when she was anxious or stressed, as well as myself, so that, you know, she could watch a video of me telling her, you know, when you are stressed out, you need to take a deep breath, sit on this bench on the sidewalk, don't walk into the street just because you're looking for a caravan. But I think it was also really beneficial for her to reiterate it and have a video of herself saying these same things that she could watch too.
Do you know which she preferred?
I think that she would actually kind of initially preferred me telling it to her because it was reassuring. But once she got more and more comfortable, I think that she liked hearing herself say it. But again, in the end, what actually ended up resolving the problems that we just needed to distract her. So she would listen to music, classical music, or NPR podcasts that we download onto her iPod. And with Beth, what's interesting is it's okay if it's the same podcast. Yeah. So we didn't necessarily have to keep a rotation of new podcasts. She just liked listening to Terry Gross and Fresh Air. So,
if you were a job support specialist, unfamiliar with this particular use of technology, and what would you want to know? What would you advise someone to do to think about beginning to use these tools?
Definitely contact, you know, if it's an individual that you're interested in having an assistive technology evaluation, sit on the evaluation with them. If you're not familiar with the technology, this is a great way for you to sit down with an OT and the individual and see the technology in action yourself, see the individual interact with the technology, because that was probably the most important thing when it comes to utilizing it, is knowing how to use it. And being creative means that you have to be able to know what apps are out there, go out, download them. Really, you could go to iTunes as well. iTunes has a special education tab and just a whole bunch of different applications that other individuals are using. Usually, obviously in kind of a special education setting, but you know, you can still see what makes sense to use on the job site. But I would also say don't limit yourself to the special education apps, because like the metronome, that would not have been in special education. You know, you just need to play with the apps and see, oh, what does this one do? Would this one help me in with my particular problem?
Well, one thing, I really agree with you on that, and I think one thing that I'm learning over time is that each of us is learning a little bit, and the more we can share what we learn, the more we all grow together, because we're really drinking out of a fire hose when you've got a million apps to play with.
Exactly.
And I'm so happy that in this project and other things that we've worked on, we've gotten that opportunity to share among ourselves through emails or conversations what's working for our clients. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share about this experience?
Yeah, I love using the iPod for AT, but again, I always have to stress it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of the world's problems. It's not going to be an instant fix for any job site. You do have to still approach it as this is a tool. You need to put the time into learning and teaching someone how to use the tool, and that, you know, a screwdriver is not going to be a universal tool for all your problems. The iPod's not going to be a universal tool for all your problems too. So for a lot of the individuals that I work with, they might have an iPod and they might have some of the apps downloaded to help them on certain tasks, but then we still have laminated pieces of paper with decision trees, and we still sometimes have paper checklists. We still use the lo-fi compensatory strategies as well. It's just great that we have the opportunity to use both of them.
Hey, thank you so much for chatting with me this morning.
Thank you.